I rarely begin a game and get progressively more into it the farther I go, but as few and far between as I've had that experience in my lifetime of playing video games, Grime checked that box in emphatic fashion. Grime was a hidden gem among hidden gems, and while not necessarily a little fish in the larger pond of indie Metroidvanias, I'd argue that it's on par with the sharks of the genre, i.e. Blasphemous, as debatably the best 2D Souls-like ever made. While not necessarily unique to Grime, its story is told through minimalism, the world is dystopian, and the boss fights are the glue that brings it all together. However, the way in which Grime sets out and fulfills these landmarks of the Souls-like genre is second to none. As per usual, we'll be taking a more in-depth view into the realm of boss fights, and Grime's was an absolutely stellar lineup. For one, this game's atypical approach to the generic kill a boss, get souls, and upgrade your inventory system was genius and genuinely innovative. Instead of the approach just mentioned, each major fight, optional or mandatory, unlocks a new traversal ability, and each optional mini-boss upgrades healing wares. The fights were all around brilliant, and I thoroughly enjoyed each and every one of them, but I have something to admit. I started Grime just days after the release of the Tinge of Terror DLC, which added a New Game Plus mode with changes to each boss and an entirely new New Game Plus exclusive boss, the Dreamborn Terror. He's not like Shidra from Colors of Rot in that he just shows up at the end. Instead, you need to complete a set of tasks to begin the fight. I spent legitimately 6 hours trying to figure out how to unlock this thing, and I just couldn't. So, out of anger, and stupidly, keep in mind, at 3 in the morning I started a New Game Plus run, and long story short, the Dreamborn Terror is not a part of this list, which really pains me because that boss looks fucking amazing. To make up for this, I'm going to do not just a ranking of the bosses, but a separate ranking of the bosses in New Game Plus at the end, so make sure to watch all the way through for both lists. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Akupara Games and Cloverbyte for a review key, and as well, to update you guys on Sonic 06, we're actually in the process of creating it now, so stay tuned. With all that said, let's get into the ranking. The Grieving Rock Giant is the only boss in the game I ever felt any amount of mild irritation fighting. Of all the mini-bosses, he killed me far and away the most times, with 7 deaths, and each death got progressively more aggravating because I completely forgot about the shortcut that leads directly into the arena, so up until about attempt 6 or 7, I took the long route each time, and it was a pain in the dick. To clarify, I love the fact that I struggled with the bosses, and I'm not dragging down any fights for their difficulty in the slightest. I haven't had that experience of facing a steep learning curve and being forced to truly internalize a boss moveset in years. I'd say the last time I even remotely felt that to the extent I did with Grime was all the way back in 2020 when I first played Blasphemous. Even with Elden Ring, I was so accustomed to the mechanics of Souls that after my short struggle period with Margit, I basically never took longer than 1 or 2, sometimes 3 attempts to beat any boss. So once again, I'm not factoring in my troubles against the Grieving Rock Giant or any boss whatsoever. The most notable tick against the Lamenting Rock Giant is that his damage output is shockingly high, and on occasion the timing window of his pullable moves are somewhat iffy. Otherwise, he's a thrill to fight. Unsurprisingly, the majority of the beginning of this list is the 6 mini-bosses, and just to get it out of the way, I'm not a huge fan of the second half of mini-boss health bars being unabsorbable, especially because there are no mid-fight changes, multiple phases, or anything of that sort. The Grieving Rock Giant has this no better or worse than any other mini-boss. I would just like to point it out now to save me the grief of having to repeatedly say it again later. Good boss. I like boss. If I was a rock giant, that's how I'd finish this segment, I think. If the Grieving Rock Giant is a gorilla, the Harmless Rock Giant is an orangutan. I fucking love orangutans. They make up half my Instagram reels, and on the topic, killing a harmless creature never feels great. This game's story is really unique in that you play as essentially a walking black hole whose sole motivation in the universe is to devour everything in its path. Unfortunately, by devouring everything, nothing can survive, and that includes the baby-like Harmless Rock Giant, who was the first mini-boss I encountered. He killed me a few times, but that was mainly due to inexperience. After I sharpened my toolkit a bit, I cruised through the oversized Rockhead, who's similar to his brother in grief but obviously more toned down due to his early game placement. With most bosses that have a head weak point, I really enjoyed waiting for the right attack and then swooping in, and there's no better case than this. The Harmless Rock Giant is very solid, especially considering it's a bottom feeder in a quality ranking. The Grieving Rock Giant may be the most difficult mini-boss, and the Desert Watcher may be the easiest. Thanks to my mastery of Sekiro, I'm pretty well tuned to timed parries and counters, and if you're even somewhat decent at that, the Desert Watcher is the equivalent to a low difficulty training bot. I fought him extremely late in the game, keep in mind, but even on New Game Plus, he took me at most a minute to beat. He was getting beat so bad he tried to crop out of the arena, but even locked out of frame, nothing could stop me. Basically, his entire moveset is beaten by either absorb or pull, meaning he'll spend more time stuck in his reeling animation than he will actually attacking you. The Jaw Stag is interesting, although with a bit of experience under my belt, there are a lot of cracks in his foundation that I can spot that make him significantly easier. The main source of Jaw Stag's challenge comes from his genuinely minuscule telegraphs. I was also fighting him at like 2:30 in the morning in my defense, but they are quick. His moveset is extremely dynamic, especially relative to other mini-bosses, and I appreciate that almost all of them are absorbable. Of the various Animalia mini-bosses, the Jaw Crab wins out. It's the only one with active changes in it, and that alone pushes it above the rest for me. The crab has a protective shell and 2 unpierceable claws that only break through absorb. You can, hypothetically, just break one and finish it from there, but in the second half it begins to use red attack combos with both appendages, so capitalizing on dodges from one side to another when both claws are broken is vital. The Jaw Crab is a really great fight, albeit short and easy, leaving it behind a good chunk of Grime's boss catalog. At last, our first Great Prey, and for me, the easy choice for worst Great Prey. Even though I'm pretty sure I fought the Rock Dog dangerously prematurely, I didn't struggle with him much, and when lined up against the rest of the Great Prey, it's mechanically primal and repetitive. The fight is fairly simple on paper. There's a flower that sprouts a rock bouncer, and then a clone of that rock bouncer joins in when the flower gets to half health. The trick is that its health bar is unabsorbable, relying on the pull mechanic for staggers and the flower occasionally popping out to provide reprieve. I didn't make use of it here because I fought it so early, but the pull damage boost hunt trait is absolutely lethal, as well as most other offensive traits, and even without the damage buff, I'd call Flower Heart a faint challenge. It's just in between monotony and excitement for me, leaving it short of the rest of Grime's Great Prey. The Artisan of Flesh was a genuine thrill ride, and the first boss of the remaining group that collectively I would label as all-around enjoyable. The Artisan of Flesh is somewhat of an offensive one-trick pony, with all of his damage coming by way of volcanic spears. These appear earlier in the Servant's Path, and from the trial and error of that area's platforming, I learned that they don't explode on impact, but rather on a set timer. With that in mind, you can actually let the spear impale you, walk up to the Artisan, then dash away and crop dust him for 200 damage. On the defensive side, he leaves a few minor inconveniences throughout, but he's fairly static, and with my Raw Blade, I could pump out a chain of hits between each time he teleported easily. The Artisan of Flesh is simple, mini-boss, but surprisingly engaging. Yeah, I know, I like an introductory boss, the dirt is brown, but in my defense, Amalgam is quite a statement initiation, forcing the player to immediately hone in Grime's most difficult mechanic, absorbing, while also looking fantastic and fighting fairly high octane for just the first major boss fight. Before you even comment on it, yeah, at the beginning I thought I'd give strength weapons a try. I quickly learned that dexterity was just simply the better option, as it always is, but weapons aren't necessarily your best form of damage here anyways, with Absorb providing the most consistent output while also neutering Amalgam, momentarily removing an arm when it gets absorbed. The main thing I appreciate about Amalgam is how each arm is completely unique in moveset and even intertwines with other arms to create incredibly fun combos, especially during the second phase. Forcing the player to somewhat master the most important mechanic in the game wasn't just great fun, but extremely helpful for the rest of the journey. Major Boss 2, I think, is evil, but at the same time, Akhlan is apparently the villain of this universe. I don't really know, but evil or not, the Whispering Mothers are great. This and Flower Heart make for the only gank fights in the game, and the dynamism of Whispering Mothers' broader moveset compared to Flower Heart's, as well as its multiple phases, scores it much higher. In the first phase, both Whispering Mothers are identical, but repeatedly swap positions and use different attacks at the same time. I much prefer this approach with an early game boss, as it's not overcomplicating anything as it would with different movesets. When you kill one mother, that specific corpse rots and the other grows in strength, beginning phase 2. This second phase is much shorter and, in my opinion, less difficult, as most of the mother's attacks are absorbable and the reflectable objects deal hefty damage if you have that trait upgraded. It still keeps up the majority of the intensity from the first phase, however, landing the soul-sucking Dictatorettes of Lithic at number 8. Talking Hand. Why the fuck not? Shapely Fidus is perhaps the most surrealist looking enemy in the game. A walking, talking hand with a fume-night greatsword. You only see that ever so often. Shapely Fidus is enjoyable on New Game and a pain in the fucking cock on New Game Plus, which I'll get into later. In both he's completely unabsorbable, but in New Game his aggression is a bit more dialed down, leaving you with at least moments of reprieve. I found that based on your distance from him, he'll do a set attack every time, so you can somewhat cheese him into the double parry pull combo pre-buff. When phase 2 kicks off and the sword becomes completely unblockable, things get a bit more tricky, obviously, but an established Souls veteran shouldn't have a ton of trouble. I personally just kept my greed in check for the most part and ended up fine. The final phase is a rare but severely underutilized time survival bit, which I appreciated a lot. Very few bosses have this, and I wish more did. It really creates a different level of urgency and intensity. GRIME checks a lot of boxes in boss mechanical variety, with Shapely Fidus filling in the attack greed void that so many fights from the Souls series masterfully followed. The original finale of GRIME doesn't hold up super well in my opinion, but immediately I'll begin by praising its use of audio cues over visual telegraphs for the main combat bits. It threw me for a loop at first, but made the fight a lot more understandable over time instead of just looking at the thing endlessly Obi-Wan spin its scythe around itself. Showing off, fucking jackass. The final performance is split into 3 main segments: the initial pull-based platforming, normal mono-e-mono combat, and a puppet phase with shades of Sally stage play. If you can fully capitalize on the first phase, you can knock out up to a third of the boss's health and further damage it during the combat. I'd recommend avoiding attacking altogether while the ballerina is in play, however. The AI is surprisingly reactive and intelligent, so the best move in my opinion is to simply not attack until it gets its cue card to leave. The final performance is a genuinely good boss, but is mainly carried by its vast phase variety. The Giant of Eyes holds the key to by far the most valuable unlockable mechanic in GRIME, surrogate teleportation. Thanks to Colors of Rot, this hulking gorilla was added, and is a great mid-game boss, as is the case with pretty much every optional GRIME fight. In New Game, I thought he was a bit too easy, mainly as a result of his similarities to the rock giants in Phase 1, and slow-moving, telegraphed attacks in Phase 2. That isn't to say he's not exciting, he wouldn't be number 5 if he wasn't, but this is a boss that was night and day better in New Game Plus thanks to the difficulty buff. My favorite aspect was absorbing his attacks, especially the long-winded overhead swing in the second phase, a la the Headless Ape. Considering he's not even required, the Giant of Eyes is a creatively spectacular encounter. Another Colors of Rot boss and the highest difficulty of the group in my opinion. Surrogate Vulture isn't necessarily the most conceptually creative idea out there, but the actual fight is so vastly different from Vulture that it makes its own mark for sure. It still shares some of the same move pool, but there's a slightly more heightened focus on hitting its weak point here, with the body being much more damage resistant than Vulture's. The first phase is pretty much Vulture as you remember him, but the second is when things get much different, it being half a survival bit and the other a slow reversion back to normalcy. While the attacks themselves were hard to differentiate at first, I had a great time learning them, especially because it wasn't through telegraphs necessarily, but where Surrogate Vulture was in the arena. I think Surrogate Vulture, while weirdly unmemorable for me, remains one of my favorites in GRIME due to its difficulty and fight structure. If Shidra had an alliterative nickname, it'd be Satisfying Shidra. He's one rewarding motherfucker to topple. In a lot of boss fights, you don't need to necessarily remember every individual attack, as most of them can be avoided by simply moving away or rolling through them, no matter what it is. This is why a game like Cuphead was so special, because it forced you to internalize every single boss due to the unmoving arenas that complemented the game's combat mechanics. Shidra is a stationary boss in an arena as wide as him, with each attack covering a certain range of the arena, from the entire floor to the air and in between. I feel like going to college has increased my IQ at least a little bit, and in turn my memory motor skills, but Shidra worked me. Now I have a total understanding of him, but it took me death after death after death after death to get to this point. From experience, I've learned that Shidra has two attacks that are absorbable that I'd say are a necessity to counter, those being the reflectable diamonds and slam. As I said earlier, this fight really felt the most like a Cuphead boss of any in Grime, especially with the platforming bit after you beat the first phase. The ending is the fruit on top of the icing on top of the cake for me. I was terrified that I was going to inevitably fuck it up and die, but he does basically no damage, and with each arm you absorb, he gets progressively weaker until you finally kill him and free the world of his shackles. What a great boss, but still, Shidra falls short of two even better fights. The fact that I managed to beat this with the Carven Greatsword is genuinely impressive. It also points out how easy this is relative to the obscenely fucking hard New Game Plus fight, which I barely scraped my way through with a +9 Raw Blade. Jesus Christ. With that perspective, Vulture on New Game is a breeze, featuring a full-length arena, no poison traps after you kill its minions, and only 2 but really 1.5 phases. The fight begins with a freebie weak point hit like Flower Heart, and for the most part this initial phase is fairly tame. I like how much this fight emphasizes the pull mechanic. Nearly every attack is pullable at some point or another, and when you do pull it successfully, you're rewarded with 2 to 3 headshots and it resets itself. The second phase begins with the Vulture's beak dramatically snapping off and is essentially a heightened version of the first that goes on as long as the Vulture's summoned snakes live. Meaning, just focus on the snakes, don't even pay attention to Vulture besides his attacks. It's not necessarily as challenging to overcome, but feels so different in approach that I like it all the same. Vulture was a brilliant fight, and as evidenced by its placement, is the best of the original Grime bosses. But not to be overshown, Misbegotten Amalgam was incontestably the best fight in the game. I already love Amalgam for what it is, but make it more fluid, difficult, and dynamic, and you have boss perfection in my eyes. Not to mention a better score, sound design, a far more visually appealing arena and setting. Just taking a clearly great outline for a boss and renovating it top-down into the mold of an endgame fight is simply a stroke of genius. The main difference between Amalgam and Misbegotten Amalgam is the shields in Amalgam are no longer present, with the top hands instead varying between an instant death crush attack that breaks half the arena struck by it, and a shockwave attack that stretches the length of the arena. Each hand also has new moves, and the attacks taken from the original Amalgam are now longer and mix up both hands, and like its predecessor, the entire thing ramps up in intensity at half health. When talking about memorizing and internalizing a boss, this is the standard. Misbegotten Amalgam is a fantastic fight, and among all in the indie Metroidvania genre, may win out as my favorite to date. With the first ranking down, it's time to compare and contrast the main bosses and their new forms in Tinge of Terror. For the record, this list will only be made up of the 8 main fights found in New Game Plus, as the mini-bosses are identical to their new game variants and Flower Heart just doesn't exist after the reality shift. Anyways, let's get into the ranking. Number 8, Shapely Fidus. Change everything enjoyable about a boss and surely it'll improve, right? Shapely Fidus on New Game Plus isn't just difficult, it's difficult in a subtly shitty way that I personally didn't enjoy at all. My biggest problem was that, when you parry him, a flame zone spawns directly under you, making the double parry pull combination nigh impossible to do consistently. And in the second phase, his aggression is so obscene it pushes the limits of fair difficulty for me. It's sort of like Slave Knight Gale if he was always doing that one combination and never did anything else. Not to mention, after you survive the end bit, a second wave of it occurs with a second hand, making it just a fucking nuisance to beat. Number 7, Vulture. I mentioned it in the Vulture segment, and no need to dance around it, this is fucking hard. It definitely comes off that I don't enjoy these fights because they're difficult, but if that was really the case, would I like any of these? Likely not. Just that I found that the changes made to Shapely Fightus and a few others in New Game Plus was detrimental to the fair difficulty balance that made the fights so great in the first place. The most striking distance in Vulture versus Vulture is that the arena is significantly tighter, the summons come in larger numbers and leave poison graves that by the end leave the arena an untraversable minefield. Oh, and a third phase at the end that I only beat thanks to dumb luck, really. Aside from the points I just made, the fight is pretty similar, but the third phase is shockingly hard. There is a bit of rhythm to it, however. I found that every combo begins with a parryable overhead swing, meaning all you really need to focus on is positioning. Keep yourself close but not too close, absorb the swing, and it'll be over soon enough. Number 6, Surrogate Vulture. Have a weak point but punish the player for hitting it? I don't really understand the concept behind it, especially considering the heart is in the air, and the electric bolt is completely undodgeable while falling vertically in midair. It's pretty much the same otherwise, bar a few extraneous changes here and there in the second phase, but that one major difference is massively downgrading for me. Number 5, Shidra of the World Pillar. Shidra's only change of note is an occasional beam that moves from one end of the room to the other like Devil and Angel from Cuphead. I struggle with this fight a good amount, but once you get used to the timing and rhythm, it's pretty much identical to its new game form. Number 4, Misbegotten Amalgam. So good, they didn't even have to change it. This would be number 1, but I think it's cheap to discredit the notably good changes made to the remaining fights. Number 3, Whispering Mothers. This killed me the most in New Game Plus, but was by trade the most satisfying to take down. I mainly struggle with the second phase that keeps the dead corpse as part of the fight, which just overall forces much more thought throughout it. Not to mention that in both phases, the mothers summon the same rocks the Artisan of Flesh does, leaving Ariel dodging out of the picture entirely. Sticking to the ground and only dashing felt very different than anything else I'd experienced in the game, and this forced change to gameplay style was a great addition that the Whispering Mothers confidently delivered. Number 2, Amalgam. I'd argue that this Amalgam is about on par with Misbegotten Amalgam in terms of difficulty, and it plays extremely similar. The whole fight feels end-to-end different, mainly a result of speed increase and longer combinations. The changes made are simple but extremely effective, leaving Amalgam's buffed variant as by far the better. Number 1, Giant of Eyes. Of all the fights in New Game Plus, Giant of Eyes was not the one I expected to be the most enjoyable. It's sort of like a random kid from high school who went from a nice dude with a shitty haircut to a Vogue model in the span of a year. Like the rest of the New Game Plus fights, the attacks are all inherently different in terms of timing, and the addition of the dark energy pillars made the second phase so much more engaging. A touch of added difficulty without necessarily changing the move pool itself can go an incredibly long way. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to Akupara Games and Cloverbyte once again for GRIME Colors of Rot. If you haven't played this game, I absolutely recommend it, and I can't wait to see what's in store in the future. Otherwise, be sure to like and subscribe, and check in every Wednesday for new uploads. That's all for now. Deuces.